everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bianca Collins. I'm the Curator of Public Programs for the Fowler Museum at UCLA. As a land-grant institution, UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of the Los Angeles Basin Southern Channel Islands, and are grateful to have the opportunity to work for the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and our relatives past, present, and emerging. The Fowler is very pleased to present today's program as part of our A Global Destination for Art series, which offers the opportunity to visit with artists creating in our City of Angels. Today, we are visiting with LA native Mark Steven Greenfield for a walkthrough of his current exhibition at William Turner Gallery, Black Madonna, followed by a conversation with Naima J. Keith. Mark Steven Greenfield uses his art to explore the African-American experience, critiquing and offering unique perspectives on a society still grappling with the consequences of slavery and racial injustice. His newest body of work consists of 17 Black Madonna paintings that reimagine medieval religious icons, rendered in the Byzantine style of their art historical predecessors. Greenfield places Black bodies in a place of exaltation, offering an imagined time that is hard to pinpoint, but during which white supremacy suffers the same vicious deaths that have historically been forced upon Black bodies. Mark Steven Greenfield studied with Charles White at Otis Art Institute, received his bachelor's degree in art education in '73 from Cal State Long Beach, and an M.F.A. in painting and drawing from Cal State LA in '87. Greenfield's work has been exhibited extensively in the United States, including a comprehensive survey exhibition at the California African American Museum in 2014. From '93 to 2011, Greenfield worked for the LA Department of Cultural Affairs as director of the Watts Towers Art Center. Later, he served as the director of the LA Municipal Art Gallery in Barnsdall Park. He currently teaches drawing and design at LA City College and serves on the board of Side Street Projects. Naima J. Keith is Vice President of Education and Public Programs at LACMA. Previously, she was Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the California African American Museum, where she guided curatorial and education departments, as well as marketing and communications. She was also an Associate Curator at the Studio Museum in Harlem from 2011 to 2016, and held a curatorial position at the Hammer Museum. Keith has lectured extensively, and her essays have appeared in numerous publications. She holds degrees from Spelman College and UCLA, and is a proud native of LA. If you have any questions during this program, we encourage you to submit them through the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can submit and upvote questions that you would like to hear answered at the end of the program. All right, that's enough from me. Enjoy the program.
So this piece is called Distress. One of the things that I found in my research is that whenever you have the American flag in an upside down position, it actually is an indication of distress. And people are to come to the rescue. And so given the political climate we've been in as of late, I decided that maybe it was time to remind people of that idea. The pieces, most of the Madonnas actually are in the classical style of mother and child. In this instance, it's derived from the Leonardo da Vinci Madonna. And most of Leonardo's Madonnas are characterized by this particular brooch that you'll see repeated in almost every Madonna that he's done. Going through the composition are these tantos, which actually are symbolic of my mantra. I've been involved in a meditative practice for nearly 45 years. And one of the things that I realize is that in the course of this, sometimes these things come about in your subconscious. This is kind of married with my Catholicism, from which I more or less escaped in my late teens. One of the things about Catholicism is that I really had a deep appreciation for the ritual and the ceremony and all the accoutrements that are associated with the religion. But sometimes I had difficulty with the dogma. After I left Catholicism, I got involved in a lot of other studies of religious practices and theology. And I finally came to the conclusion that meditation actually facilitated all of these beliefs. And so this symbol here that you see going through most of the pieces represents a characterization of my mantra. This piece is called Collateral. I worked in Watts for a number of years as the director of the Watts Towers Art Center. And I had a lot of interactions with gang members in that neighborhood. And one of the things that always came up that was most lamentable was the fact that oftentimes people would get caught in the crossfire and they would be killed. So what I have here is, again, a Madonna holding her son, similar to the Pieta. And then you'd have tennis shoes down at the bottom here that represent all the shoes of all the people that were killed as a result of the accidents. On either side, in the classical triptych style, you would have these gang members who were in their underwear because I want them to appear to be completely vulnerable. And again, you have the suggestion of the mantra that goes throughout. Part of the formula for these Madonnas actually is the Madonna itself and then the background, which in this instance is done in gold leaf. Because what I'm trying to do is emphasize the value of and the reverence that the church paid to the Madonna. So that's one of the reasons why I use gold leaf in these. This is actually the last Madonna that I did in this particular part of the series, and it's called Toppling. And it really calls back to the whole idea that, you know, these Confederate monuments are now being taken down. It should have been taken down a long time ago. But in this instance, you have mother again and child. In most of the Madonnas, what you find is that the mother is more or less protecting the child from what's happening in the background. It was difficult because of the ornamentation that's on this. You have to understand that this particular type of painting I haven't done in nearly 30 years. And so for me, it was almost like going back to school. But it was something that I felt needed to be done, particularly given the times that we're in. So this was actually the second piece in the series. It's called Burning Down the House. And it's interesting because it happened at a time I was listening to David Byrne, and I had him pumped up on terms of volume, and it's like I was just grooving with it. And the idea came to me, it's like, if you're gonna burn down a house, burn down the plantation house. So that's what's going on here. You have the Confederate flag going on. Again, you have Madonna and child. I always try to inject a little bit of humor into my pieces because what I find is that sometimes people can zero in on that and it helps to sometimes buffer the more difficult aspects of a piece. And so in this instance, I have the child holding an Afro pick. He's being suckled by his mother at the time, but you've got these horrific things that are going on in the background. You have all these tools that are in your toolbox, and they're developed somewhere between undergrad and graduate school. And so when I was in undergrad, I was actually interested in education. But when I went to graduate school, I was interested more in painting and drawing. But almost as soon as I got out of graduate school, I went into digital, which was very interesting because people who had been following my work for a long time said, you know, we like what it is that you're doing, but we don't see your hand in it anymore. And, you know, it got me to thinking, it's like, you have this facility. Yeah, it's difficult to do. Use that facility, and hopefully over time it becomes easier. So I got back into painting, but there was a time when creating these folds in fabric and some of the treatment of fabric was a lot easier to me than it was this time. One of the other issues is that in oil paints, this is actually a lot easier to do, but I'm allergic to oil. So I had to use acrylic paint. And so sometimes in getting some of those fine subtleties in acrylic paint, it's a little difficult because acrylic dries so fast. And for whatever reason, I don't like using extender because it somehow messes with the color, I think. So some of these were painfully difficult, particularly the first ones. As time went on, they kept getting a little easier and a little easier. So right now I'm kind of in the zone. You know, the spiritual aspects of this cannot be understated because the whole idea of the Madonna and that intense love between mother and child, and particularly in the context of African Americans, when you look at it, the mother figure is so important in terms of raising that child, making that child as strong as they can be, giving the talk to the child at the right time so that that child doesn't run into things in society that would be harmful to them. You know, those things all resonate with me. You know, my mother raised me by herself for a number of years, and I put her through holy hell for a while. But the lessons that she taught me stuck with me, and they, you know, to some degree, are encapsulated in some of these pieces. Part of my experience in Watts, I had a lot of interaction with both Crips and Bloods and other gang members too. And the thing is, I think all of us rejoiced when we realized that the Crips and the Bloods were to sign this truce. And so this piece is called Truce, and it's in celebration of the gang truce, which has been in place since 1993. And the thing that so impressed me about it was that it took a great deal of insight on the part of both of those gangs to understand that they weren't really enemies of each other, and they were killing each other senselessly. And they started to come to a much more sophisticated political awareness of their situation. So again, we have the Crips and the Bloods. A lot of people don't understand what Crips stood for. It actually stood for Community Revolution in Progress. And it was an outgrowth of the Black Power movement. It was subverted within about 6 months of it being founded. And as with any yin, you have to have a yang. And in that case, it turned into the Bloods. In this instance, I'm actually drawing back to my experiences in Brazil, where I had the opportunity to go to an Egungun ceremony. Now, Egungun is it's a pretty elaborate ceremony that's held on this one island called Itaparica in Brazil. And it represents, it has its roots in Africa. These Eguns have incredible power. They channel the spirit energy of ancestors. So in the ceremony, you're actually locked in a room that's much like a church. You're in there with about 250 people. And one by one, these Eguns would come out. Now understand these Eguns are in a trance. And they've been in a trance for a few days prior to the ceremony. The Eguns, everybody wants to get close to the Eguns because of the blessings, but they also embody a lot of negative energy. So there's this, again, interplay between positive and negative. If an Egun touches you, you're actually marked for death. People have been known to walk out of the ceremony, get struck by lightning, hit by cars, have heart attacks, all kinds of things. I'm not a believer, but I have a healthy respect for other people's beliefs. One of the other things that the Egun, one of the other purposes that an Egun serves is actually as an intermediary. And so I saw it as a natural figure of the Egun here to be an intermediary between these two gangs. This one is called What's That Funky Smell? And what it shows is somebody in an orange jumpsuit being electrocuted. One of the things that always strikes me are a number of people who have been executed by mistake, things that they've never done, and they protest their innocence right up until the end. And oftentimes, I think a person's last dying words are probably the ones that are going to be the most truthful. So again, I kind of flipped the script on this one. I have a white supremacist who's being executed in this. And mother is basically protecting the child, saying, you don't need to see this. Concurrent with the Madonna series, I've actually started to focus on what people might consider to be folk saints. And these are people that the Catholic Church, for whatever reason, has decided not to beatify and not to canonize. But everybody in a particular community sees them as having lived a saintly life. So one of the ones that's really prominent in Brazil is Anastasia. And you would go to just about any small town and they would have shrines to Anastasia that were established. She was reputed to be a slave of remarkable beauty. Nobody really knows if she was born in Africa or came from Brazil. She had these striking blue eyes, and she was reputed to have been just a good soul. Later in her life, a number of miracles were actually attributed to her, which is one of the prerequisites for being a saint in the Catholic Church. But the Catholic Church refused to recognize it. And in the early, I think in the early 1800s, they tried to erase any memory of her ever being there. And so you can still find shrines to her, and the people still pray to those shrines. But she was muzzled, and she had a slave collar that was put on her. The muzzle, nobody really knows exactly why. Some people say they put the muzzle on her because she was inciting the other slaves to revolution. Other people say that the muzzle was put on her because she had put off the sexual advances of her master. Still others say that the muzzle was put there as a result of the mistress being jealous of her beauty. But at any rate, the combination of the muzzle and the slave collar started to cut into her, and she developed tetanus, and she passed away as a result. But on her dying bed, she forgave her master and her mistress, and she healed the master's son. This piece is actually called Hive Mantra. It's really interesting. I was at a park one day, and I was meditating, but in the background, there were all these bees that were humming around. And I started to get on the same wavelength and the same tone as the bees with my mantra. And so I started realizing that collectively, when these bees make this noise, it's that vibration. And it's a vibration that's very, very close to the earth. And so I did this piece actually kind of as an homage to the bees. You know, a lot of bee populations are collapsing. And I think it's something we need to really be concerned about, because when they go away, we go away. But in this piece, actually hidden, there are a number of bees. Sometimes I lose track of them myself. But this symbol here, again, going back to the same tantos that were in the Madonnas, actually is a characterization of the mantra. These pieces are done on Duralar, which is kind of it's in the mylar family. It's translucent, looks a lot like vellum, but it is plastic. And so all the line work here is actually done on the surface, but at the same time, it allows me to do line work on the back of it. And so that's why some of these look a little bit diffuse. They're not as pronounced as some of the other shapes. And then once you finish with that, you can roll the back of it with a base color. In this instance, you know, kind of this honey gold. And that gives you a completed piece. The process of doing these large-scale, very graphic pieces has really put me in the same state as meditation. The end result of this is secondary to the state that it puts you in while you're doing it. And so, you know, the work itself is a meditation, because when you start doing these, a lot of these are done very, very spontaneously, these marks. And they're kind of filled out in a graphic style, but think of it as being very, very small gestures of the hand. And as you're doing this, your respiration goes down, your heart rate goes down, and you kind of reach this baseline place, which is very much akin to where you are in the state of meditation. This piece is called CC2. There is also a CC3. CC stands for cosmic consciousness, which is an aspiration that most meditators try to get to. In a way, this piece was kind of is a forerunner to Hive Mantra and CC2 and CC3. Again, with these mark-making situations here, but this is actually supposed to be representative of a cotton field. And there's a companion piece to this that's called The Consequences of an Unmet Quota. And it's a similar piece, but it has a bullet that comes out here, and some of the cotton is actually covered in blood. You could not sell cotton that had blood on it. So, you know, even though there was a price to pay for it, there was there was a revenge that was also extracted. In this instance, this is called crop circle. There's an area here which is undefined, and it's intentional because I want you to concentrate on the mystery of what could actually exist in that space. There are all kinds of possibilities. It could be a fallen person. It could be somebody that's just asleep. But the process of creating these is much the same as the process of creating the tantos in CC2, CC3. Very, again, spontaneous lines, but to some degree controlled in that there is a certain symmetry to it, and as you go back, this cotton gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Now this piece is called Zhong, and it has to do with the Zhong Massacre. A lot of people are very unaware of it. It happened in the late 1700s. There was a ship that was transporting slaves from West Africa to Jamaica. And in the course of the voyage, the captain realized that he was a little lost, but compounding the situation was the fact that he hadn't put enough provisions aside to sustain the slaves that he had taken. Realizing this, somewhere in mid-voyage, he decided to throw 130 slaves overboard. And so what you have here are some of these slaves that have been thrown overboard, and as it goes here, the longer they're in the water, the more they kind of morph into the spirit world. And so you'll see that they start to become a little bit more distorted here and kind of fade into all of this. The process here is much like CC1, CC2, and CC3, but in this instance, the contrast is really important because, again, it goes from that whole idea of life moving towards death in the spirit world. The J.W. Turner painting that was done in the early 1840s is actually based on the Zhong Massacre. And one of the interesting parts of this is that when they go to Jamaica, they try to sue for the insurance value of the slaves, and it was denied them. And so when they go back to England, they try to take the case up again, and again, they didn't win. But the court did say that under some circumstances it was okay to kill slaves. There was such outrage in the population about what had happened with the Zhong Massacre that it gave rise to the abolitionist movement in England. And within another 12 years, slavery was abolished in England. It's interesting, throughout the trajectory of my career, I've always addressed issues that deal with social justice, racial inequities. It's always been important to me to be didactic in many respects because it's too easy as an artist to fall into the area of being self-indulgent. If your art can serve a purpose, it can edify, it can educate, it can illuminate certain situations. For me, it's incumbent to do those things. And so it's one of the reasons that my art has always been steeped in a certain level of politics.
That was a great video. Hi, Mark. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm well. Before we jump into conversation, I just want to thank the Fowler for inviting us to be in conversation. We've known each other for a long time, but I think this is one of our first actual more formal conversations. So it's I can't think of a better series to talk about this afternoon. But again, just special thank you to the Fowler, particularly to Bianca and her team for organizing today's program. I really enjoyed the videos. I think it gave people an opportunity to really see the work and to hear you talk about it in depth. I think, just because of the COVID world that we're in, everyone might not have been able to see the show yet. So anyway, it was a great way to kind of kick off this program. But I think I think the best way to start this conversation is to say congratulations. The show has received rave reviews. Everyone that's gone to see it has said, how amazing the exhibition is and just how beautiful the show is. So first, I just want to say congratulations. So, with that said, I think it's, and you do obviously talk about this in the video, but for those who are maybe just joining us or didn't get a chance to see the entire thing, I think it's important to really talk about your process for the exhibition. It's my understanding that you started the series about 2 years ago. Is that correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's right.
So yeah, would love to hear more about your process, not just in terms of like the first work, but really what was kind of inspiration for this body of work. And then again, just kind of thinking about the amount of detail, if you could just kind of walk us through your process.
Well, in 13, I was fortunate enough to have received an artist residency in Brazil, in Salvador, Bahia. And I was on an island called Itaparica. And it actually was the most peaceful time I've ever spent in my life. I was there for 3 months. The island itself has a certain magic about it because it's thick with spirit. There's spirit everywhere. The island was one of these places where the slave traders would actually drop the slaves before they took them to the mainland. And some of the practices actually continued on the island. And while I was there, I was able to witness half a dozen ceremonies. There's Condemblé, there's something called Kabucos, which deals with the cowboy culture. But the most important for me was Igungun, which goes back to Africa. And the other thing about being in Brazil is that whenever you go to a church, you look at all these statues and they're all Black, you know? And it's really kind of, you know, paying tribute to the people that are there. You know, the Catholic Church was always sensitive to the populations that they tried to convert. And so they wanted to put images up there that kind of looked like those people. So I probably thought about it then, but didn't really figure out how I was going to carry it out. It wasn't until the show that opened at the Fowler in 2018, I think it was, on Bahia. And in seeing that show, I was reminded of you know, everything that I experienced when I was there. And soon after that, and these are all things that happen in the subconscious, I was able to create this work. And I decided to do these Black Madonnas because probably I had seen so many of those when I was in Brazil.
No, it's interesting. I mean, just kind of, I mean, you know, just to think about all of these different moments that are kind of leading up to something, you don't know, you know, what it's going to kind of lead to, but just the idea that all these different experiences, whether or not it's Bahia, whether or not it's here in LA at the Fowler, or just, you know, previous bodies of work that kind of led to the production of this series. But I think what, you know, so there's both the inspiration for this body of work, but then also the work itself. I think what really just blows people away, I think, is just the amount of detail that's poured into each and every piece. So can you talk, and obviously the painstaking detail, but just the detail, and you talk about that in the video, but can you talk a little bit about your production process?
You know, when I was growing up, I had a great deal of admiration for those monks that used to spend, you know, laborious hours doing illuminated scrolls and making the icons and things like that, because they had nothing else to do. And I realized that, you know, that was the contemplative spirit that is in so many ways embodied in my meditative practice. And so I wanted to kind of emulate that. And the other thing that I started to realize, and this is, you know, completely off market situation, but you know, you do all this work and after a while you develop so much inventory. And I wanted to create fewer pieces, but spend longer on them. And so I put myself in a position where I didn't rush any of these things. As I said in the video, I was kind of relearning how to paint, which was an interesting exercise in itself. I think that whole, the meditative through line that is in most of my work is something that's very, very important to me. And as I said, you know, particularly dealing with some of those the other pieces, it became really important that the process kind of overshadowed the end result for me.
But I'm also just curious, literally about the process. I mean, is there, you know, do you work at a certain time of day? Do you have a certain type of music on, you know, while you're working? You know, like you were saying that this meditative process is kind of through line in your work. I'm just kind of curious if there are tools or things you've developed to kind of put you in that, put you in that headspace, right? So it's not
always listening to music, a lot of jazz, a lot of spiritual stuff, a lot of ethnic stuff. I mean, you know, recently I got into Ethiopian music, which is like, it's bumping, you know, I'm loving that stuff. So that's part of it. I usually I like to work late at night, sometimes into the morning. It kind of goes back to those days when I was working a job and doing work at the same time, where I was keeping real crazy hours and I was pretty sleep deprived.
Right.
I would work a job for 8 hours, come in, eat dinner, get into the studio, work till 3, get up at 8, do the whole thing over again, And that went on for a long time.
Yeah. No, I
And I
mean,
realized that that's kind of what you had to do to support your passion.
right, right.
I had so many friends who, bless their hearts, are purists. They won't do anything but their art. They would call me up saying, can I come over and use your shower? Can you feed me? Stuff like that.
Yeah, but I mean, that's, I wanted for you to touch on that just, just out of necessity.
Yeah.
Those
I mean,
habits.
the thing is, and I tell my students now, if you're going to pursue this as a vocation, you have to figure out a way to support that passion, because you
Right.
cannot rely on just making, sales. It just doesn't happen that way.
No, definitely. And so there's both the, the immense amount of detail, which again, you talk about in the video, but there's also the decision to, utilize the imagery of the Black Madonna. Why the Black Madonna out of all of the different kind of religious iconography that you could have kind of pulled from? I love the way in the video you talk about the relationship between the, the mother and child and how you wanted to maintain that in your work. But I think just kind of starting with why the Black Madonna, you obviously could have referenced any number of religious figures.
When I first saw Black Madonnas, it was when I was in churches in Europe, and I'd see these things, and they stood out because everything else in the church was white. It was like, well, that's interesting. I wonder why. And people were running around talking about they turned black because of the soot in the churches and stuff like that. But interestingly enough, all the other statues didn't turn black, just that one. So I started to realize there has to be a reason for this. When I started researching it, and I found that the Black Madonna was so often associated with mystery, and that it really became prominent in the 13th and 14th centuries, right after the Renaissance. It was that whole thing of you have to come from a place of darkness in order to achieve enlightenment. And so I said, well, that's an interesting twist. The Catholic Church doesn't really explain what the Black Madonna is about. It kind of leaves it really nebulous in terms of where you go with it. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it held all the intrigue of a blank canvas. You can do anything on this that you want to do. And so I chose to use it maybe as a metaphor for a new Renaissance that I hope we're going through now. Mm-hmm. At least I hope so. We'll see.
But you were very intentional, not just with the imagery of the Black Madonna, but also her coloring, her skin color.
Yeah, I wanted to make it as black as I possibly could. And in order to do that, you can't just use Mars black, okay? Right. You have to touch it up with some stuff. So there are hints of blue in there. There are hints of purple. So I came up with my own blackness, so to speak. And I also wanted them to be so black that when you saw them from across the room, you couldn't really make them out, and that it forced you to actually come closer to them so that you could see the detail.
Right. I think I remember, in seeing the exhibition, I was immediately kind of struck by the color, right? The very kind of clear choice around blackness. Mm-hmm. And I was, when I was seeing the show, I was kind of curious that was it meant to contrast with the gold? Was it meant to, make some kind of commentary on blackness? Like I was just very curious on this very deliberate decision to engage with a certain color of blackness. And so it's interesting that you, like I said, that you wanted to not only make them kind of like unmistakably black, right? Like this Black Madonna is a black.
Exactly. And I wanted to also set it apart from the traditional Black Madonnas that you see, because they're not that black, okay? They're much more brown or, bronze toned or something like that. These, I wanted to make sure that there was no question that they would be black.
Right. And also the baby figure is also black. I mean, there's no mistaking, not just the relationship between the two, but then also, like I said, their skin color, right? Like I said, I was just really struck by that. And I think that, again, this, decision to not only, make them a certain color so that you were kind of forced to kind of reckon with that dynamic, but also to kind of pull the viewer in. So mm-hmm. It's kind of like playing on multiple levels. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But can you also talk a little bit about scale? You could get a sense in the video in terms of how large or how small they are in reference to your own
Mhm.
body, but can you talk a little bit about your decisions around scale and, and what was the kind of meaning behind that, if anything?
What's interesting, there were some practical considerations around scale. Oftentimes, you have to travel around with the work, or you have to transport it someplace. It's like, you want to be able to do that without renting a truck. But
Right.
the other part of that,
Yeah.
the other part of it, quite frankly, was that when you look at icons, they're usually not that big. A matter of fact, they're considerably smaller than what I've done. And an icon back in the day was actually used more or less as a talisman. They would carry these icons in front of them when they were in procession. Sometimes they carry icons in front of them when they went to war, and for different ceremonies and high holy days and things like that. So I wanted to put them in of a scale that was manageable, but I also wanted to put them at a scale that would cause you, as I said, before, is to get close to them, so
Right.
that you actually study them, so that you can get into them. And sometimes with larger pieces, there's too much of a tendency to just kind of glance by them. It's like, okay, I get it, I see it.
Right.
So
But also
I
with
wanted to make
larger,
it a little bit more intimate.
but also with larger works, you tend to kind of insert yourself into the work. You could physically, you feel a certain relationship to the work when they're very large. And like I said, with these, like you're like literally kind of like you're always an outsider, right? Like you're not necessarily in the work, even if you can identify with some of the references, you're always kind of like peering in to the work versus
Right.
necessarily inserting yourself. Um, and then, so there's like color, there's scale, and then also, there's interplay between both historical references and also contemporary ones, right? So you talk about in the video how, there's the flags and those kinds of things. Why was it important for you to have that interplay? And most times with, like I said, the Black Madonna kind of in the foreground, and then this, more kind of contemporary issue in the background. So you're kind of paying even more attention to that relationship. Why was it important for you um, to kind of inspire that kind of conversation, that kind of relationship?
Well, if you're familiar with my work, and so you know that I don't shy away from controversy.
No.
You know,
No.
one of the things that, in exploring the subconscious, to some degree, with what's happening in the background, I was actually getting into the subconscious of some people, some other white supremacists. You know, I looked at it from the standpoint that a lot of what motivates them is fear. And I realized that to a large extent, their fear translates into some of those scenes that I've created in the background. So that represents their subconscious. And once they realize that that's where their fear is, perhaps they can deal with it in a different way. It's there's this, some people compare it to revenge fantasies or things like that. It's not really revenge. It's a matter of exposing those things that you're afraid of. The way I try to put it is like, if somebody in my tribe committed some atrocity, say slavery, for instance, even though it happened hundreds of years ago, I have no connection with it. In the back of my mind, I would always have this fear of retribution.
Right, right.
And so once you realize that that is in your subconscious, take it out, deal with it, look at it. Try to understand what it is that you can do to assuage that in both yourself and also in other people. So what we're going through now politically and with racial tensions and stuff like that, a lot of it has to do with people now grappling with that. Because when some of these killings happen, people would call me up and they say, what can we do? What can I do? Stuff like, it's like, what can we do? I don't have anything to do with that. I'm tired of it. I've done my work. The work that has to happen now has to happen with you and your people. When you see something or hear something like that, call people out on it. Say that is unacceptable. If you're not willing to do that, if you're too scared to do that, then you're not doing either one of us any good.
So do you feel like in a way that this work is doing that, where it's like not just, it's calling on those fears, it's visualizing what those fears, this idea that it's on one level in the background, but I think especially this last couple of years, it's not in the background, right? It's in our faces every single day.
Well, it's been in my face ever since I could remember. Okay, so it's nothing new for me. People
Right.
talk about the work and they say, "Oh, it's so timely," and it's like, well, it's not really timely to me because that's what I've been living through. I understand that. That's what my people have been living through. So, if you think it's timely, that's fine. It's timely enough to do something about it.
But so you're walking through the exhibition. You are seeing these different Black Madonnas in these different ways, and again, you're looking closely. You're paying very close attention, and then you come across other works where, at first glance, there are several different Black men, and then there are bandanas, and their shoes, and and you realize that there are references to different gangs. I'm assuming here in LA, and they kind of just like surprise you. One, they're slightly larger in scale, but two, they're like right in the midst. Like it's not like they're called out in any one particular way. So I was very curious about the decision in terms of the layout, to kind of place these works in the midst of kind of the Black Madonnas, and what's the relationship between kind of these works or these kind of references to these gang members, and then, like I said, the Black Madonnas.
There, there isn't that solid connection that you're looking for. I really consider
No,
those to be a separate body of work, but they're complementary of the Black Madonnas in that, what I'm doing is actually kind of reimagining what a saint is. In some instances they are, canonized saints, but in some instances they're people who've lived a saintly life, who have kind of folk saint status in their own communities. And there are a lot of those people that exist that are under-recognized or unrecognized completely. So, this is kind of a taking off point for the new series that I intend to work on now. I intend to tell some of those stories of some of those people who lived a heroic life or who lived a saintly life. Because maybe by studying their stories, it will inform us in terms of better ways that we can live.
I love that. I think because oftentimes you see, gang members kind of characterized in a certain way, right? Like it's definitely not kind of highlighting, um, the relationship that you might have, the conversation that you might have had, right? In the video, you talk about how, as a director of the Watchtowers Art Center, that you had to have many conversations with gang members. And, I think by just, including that work and providing that kind of connection, I think you're allowing visitors to see, not just Black men, but I think Black, the gang members in a different way. Like there's definitely kind of an elevation or a complexity to the conversation that you're adding. I think it's not
I think a lot
often.
of people don't understand exactly what makes a gang member.
Yeah.
Oftentimes it's as a result of the absence of unconditional love. They're not getting it at home. They're not getting it anyplace else. They're definitely not getting it in school. The police are hounding them all the time. When they start hanging with their homies, that's where they actually start to feel real, because that's where they're getting their spiritual nourishment on a lot of levels. So I'm not, I abhor some of the things that the gangs have done.
Mm-hmm.
I'm distressed at the level to which they've been corrupted over the years, but I also understand why they are the way they are. It doesn't make it any better. I've had experiences where I've actually been able to turn some of them around, which I think were some of the most defining experiences that I had when I was working in Watts. Mm-hmm. I hope that other people will take on that mantle and do the same thing at some point.
I'm always, struck. No, let me just rephrase by saying, you've had such an interesting, I think, just life, in terms of growing up and, all that kind of stuff. So, and you talk about your experiences in Bahia, you've obviously done a lot of traveling, a lot of these things have kind of influenced your work. And so I'd love to just kind of talk a little bit further just about influence. I mean, the fact that you were, born into a military family, you spent your early years, in Germany and Taiwan, and you came here to LA. Yeah. You talked about, a few minutes ago, kind of talking about how, this is nothing new in terms of these kind of racial dynamics and complexities and all those kinds of things. So I'm just always kind of intrigued, I think, by your own And then, obviously, again, kind of spending time as a director of Watts Towers Art Center. I mean, you've spent time at the police academy, like all as a graphic designer, you literally live like 20 lives. So can you talk a little, and then obviously, you've had the privilege of being mentored by some of, the city's most iconic artists. So I'm just so like intrigued about, your background as an artist. So can you talk just a little bit about, this kind of culmination of these experiences and just some of the lessons that you've learned, I think, in terms of being or kind of, occupying all these different lives.
Well, there are certain disadvantages to actually being a military brat. You have this you don't make friends easily because you don't know from one minute to the next if your father's going to be transferred someplace else and stuff like that. So it was always kind of this touch and go type of situation. It's really interesting though, because my father had some rank, that I didn't really experience that classic type of racism until I came back to the States. I was somewhat insulated from that. But I think probably at the age that I experienced it, that type of racism, it made a much more indelible impression on me. And I felt the need to actually work against it to the degree that I could. I started to understand that there are certain messages that can be communicated through art that can't be communicated in any other way. And then sometimes those things can cut through some other levels of consciousness to take you to a place where you never thought you'd be able to go. And so particularly in the 60s, during the Black Power movement, 70s, I realized that art served a purpose. People were running around saying, Black is beautiful, but there weren't enough images out there that really said that. So I was about creating those images, and some of my colleagues were doing the same thing. There was a very, very small but very active African-American art making community. Most of the ones that were getting the attention were a lot older, and out of deference to them, realizing that the pie was only so big, we pretty much, surrendered and said, take it, run with it, do whatever. And we were all hoping that our turn would come around eventually. And a lot of my friends actually gave it up. They said they couldn't do it anymore. And these were good artists. These were people who had a strong practice, who had a strong philosophy behind what it is that they were doing. But with the absence of support, they just gave up. I'm really heartened to see what's happening with younger artists now. And I'm so glad that they're getting the attention that they are. It's very heartening. That's all I can say.
I feel the same way about you and your work. So. Did you grow up Catholic?
I was raised Catholic, very much. I was an altar boy. I learned the Mass in Latin. And when you're dragged around different places in Europe, it's like, well, what do we see here? Let's go to the church. Let's go see the cathedral, So I was in and out of cathedrals all the time. And even to this day, whenever I travel, I try to find Buddhist temples or cathedrals or churches or something like that to go in, because I realize that these are buildings that were created to instill a sense of peace. And so when I go into these places, and I'll sit for a few minutes, I don't have to spend a long time there, but I'll just get the vibe of the place,
Yeah.
Stone has stories, the floor has stories, the pews that you're sitting in have stories, stuff like that. And I feel that way about just about any church I go into.
I ask only because we've opened up the Q&A, so I'm looking through some of the questions, and there are a lot of questions about the Black Madonnas. And so wanted to kind of think about your own kind of personal, we talked a little bit about your kind of research into them and you seeing them, on your travels, but I was just also kind of curious about your kind of personal connection to Catholicism. But weaving in some of the questions that we're getting in the Q&A, again, there are a few of them about the Black Madonna, and everything from, does the Ogun replace or represent the Black Madonna in truce is one of the questions. There's also a question about the Black Madonna in terms of holding a green apple, kind of symbolism and meaning in that. So I guess we can, since there seem to be a few questions, we can pivot back to kind of talking about the Black Madonna specifically. So I guess we'll start with the symbolism. And so not just the symbolism of their presence, but also in terms of what they're doing and what they're holding.
Right. The Agun does not actually represent the Madonna. You know, the Agun actually does represent itself. When you see the Madonnas that are holding things like fruit, those things actually appeared in the Madonna paintings that those are taken from. Understand that most of these Madonnas are actually taken from classic Madonnas of Da Vinci and Bellini and Raphael and artists of the 13th and 14th and 15th century. There's this sacred, kind of the sacred triangle that happens in each of those compositions, going from the top of the Madonna's head down to her arms and ultimately to what she's holding. And that sacred triangle, that sacred, I should say sacred geometry is something that is central to almost all those, the Madonnas that you would see throughout history.
And then, you know, in terms of, you know, connecting, how would you connect the Black Madonnas to cultural globalization?
That's a good question.
Well, I guess, you know, one way, I don't want to obviously reframe this person's question, but, you know, the idea that, let me say, the question struck for me is that, you know, you see the Black Madonna kind of appearing in several different cultures, right? So it's not, there's, you know, what you saw in Bahia, and there's also, you know, the Black Madonna kind of appearing in other regions.
Right.
And so, you know, just kind of talking about, do the Black Madonnas that appeared in other regions have the same kind of origin story?
Not necessarily. It's really interesting. The Catholic Church kind of suppresses any reference to the Black Madonnas and the legend of Osiris and Horus in Egypt. Okay, and there are other cultures that have a different take on what the Black Madonna is about. There's in Poland, there's a very renowned Black Madonna. In France, there was a Black Madonna which controversially was painted over in white, which caused a big brouhaha in the art world. And I think it's in Chartres in France. But I think what's, you know, because the Black Madonna is kind of like this tabula rasa, people have put just about any expectation or any, they've colored it in the way that they want to.
Right.
They put all kinds of things on it that may or may not exist, but the Catholic Church doesn't refute any of those things because, again, the Catholic Church has this image shrouded in so much mystery.
Right.
And believe me, I tried to go as far as I could. It's like, you know, short of going to the Vatican.
But it's just interesting how, again, there's like this, not repression necessarily, but the mystery, right? So there's no real kind of like concrete story. Right. So there's the allowance to kind of like, it could be this, it could be that, but not necessarily just the complete like shutting down.
Which is contrary to just about everything else in Catholicism, okay? Because everything else in Catholicism is well-defined, you know, this is established, blah, blah, blah. But the Black Madonna has remained a mystery for hundreds of years.
It's so interesting.
So I can bring it out and I can literally attach anything I want to it.
I want to spend the last couple minutes because, you know, we've got also a couple of questions. I think people were really kind of inspired by your optimism around, you know, young artists working today, and really just being, you know, like I said, you just kind of heartened, you know, just kind of feeling really good about, you know, the love that a lot of, you know, young artists are getting in LA right now. So there's, again, kind of ending on that note. So, you know, what words of support do you have for a Black artist in school? And then where would you like to see the future of African-American artists?
Well, when you're in school, in academia, they teach you the basics, but really good teachers will tell you that at some point you have to unlearn what you've learned. So it gives you the tools that you need in order to create all kinds of things. But what everybody is hoping is that you'll find a variation on that, on the use of that tool. Use it in a way that it hasn't been used before. Use a medium that you haven't used before. Use a medium that nobody else has used before in a different way. And be sure to be able to find ways to support yourself while you're doing that, because it is a passion. What was the second part of that question?
Where would you like to see the future of African-American artists? Yeah, African-American artists.
Actually, I think we're seeing the future now. You know, I mean, when I was growing up, there wasn't any concerted effort to even collect African-American artists by institutions. And that's all changing now. You know, I mean, there are institutions that they're woke. They realize that, you know, it's time to get with the program, that it's time to figure out different ways of diversifying your audiences. And in order to do that, people have to go to those museums and see things that look like them. You know, museums have to figure out ways of not being art prisons. You know, this is important. So I think, you know, we're well on the way to establishing that as like the new norm.
Right.
I'm just hoping it continues.
I totally agree. Well, thank you so much, Mark. We see Bianca's, you know, joined us to say, you know, unfortunately, we have to end our conversation. But I think if folks out there have not already, please go see the exhibition at William Turner Gallery in Santa Monica. And then, like I said, there are plenty of amazing reviews of the show, as well as videos and those kinds of things. So again, thank you, Mark. Congratulations. And the show is up until
the 28th
of November.
Yeah, the gallery will be open on the 27th, the day after Thanksgiving.
Oh, okay, great. So you can, you know, take your family, obviously with your masks on, and go see the show. So yes, congratulations and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much, Mark and Naima, for sharing your art and your perspectives with us today. It was such a pleasure to have this time with you both. And thank you to everyone who joined us. This program has been recorded. It will be available on our Instagram and on our website for everyone to revisit and share as you wish. Thank you again. I hope that everyone will join us for our next program. Details can be found on the closing slide. Have a great weekend. Thank you.